Why don't we just start at the beginning here with the definition, because this is a key thing. I'll have a piece actually at the Reload on this, and I've talked about this with CNN colleagues before as well. But methodology, right? It's very important. There are several mass shooting counters out there, and they vary wildly. If you look at the bank shooting that took place in Louisville this week, that depending on the count that you go by, that's either the 146th mass shooting, the 15th, or the 4th. Now, you guys would be the 4. And so give us an understanding of why that is. What do you guys count as a mass shooting?
Yeah, you mentioned James Allen Fox. He's a pioneer in the field of this research, and we certainly sort of stand on the shoulders of those types of giants. And he was one of the individuals that was really instrumental in thinking about definitions. Definitions matter in social science, and we all know that. And when you're focusing on a very specific phenomena, you want to be very careful about how you're defining the parameters around it. So one of the things that James Fox talks about is that death is different, and that although the body count is an arbitrary number, it could be 3, it could be 4, it could be 5. There is something qualitatively different about those mass shootings that result in mass killings and mass casualties, maybe versus those that result in multiple people shot and injured, but not necessarily killed. Now, that doesn't diminish the tragedy, though, of those other events. And I think this is the important piece, which is as long as you're very clear about what definition you're using and why you're using it, and that transparency and accountability is there, then everybody knows what everyone's talking about. But unfortunately, what we often see is that people use these definitions interchangeably, maybe to advance some sort of agenda or whatever it is. And that can lead to a lot of confusion in the public, because then they're asking themselves, well, is it 4, is it 15, or is it hundreds? And we don't know. Right. I think the other piece is this. In our research, we're focusing on a very specific phenomena, which is this sort of indiscriminate public mass killing, where somebody goes into a church, a bank, a school, and perpetrates what many of us think of as a mass shooting. That is qualitatively different from, for instance, a gang-related shooting, or from domestic violence where somebody kills their family. And again, none of that diminishes the tragedy of those other things. They also need research and focus and attention and solutions, but they need different solutions. They need a different focus. There's a rich literature on gangs and gang intervention. I've written a lot of it, actually. I do a lot of research in the area of gangs. There's a rich literature in the area of domestic violence and domestic homicide. And what we're trying to do is contribute to that literature around these public mass shootings, which require a different sort of understanding from those other forms of gun violence.
Yeah, and I think you hit on the perfect explanation of why I prefer your definition. Now, so it's 4 or more people killed in a public mass shooting, and you exclude things like robberies or gang-related incidents is the basic definition that you guys use.
That's
I think it was
correct.
The Congressional Research Service was the one that detailed it, but that's what you guys use. There's James Allen Fox's definition includes 4 or more killed, but they also include this is the 15 domestic homicides that happen inside of someone's house, which happen to be the most common form of when someone kills 4 or more people, unfortunately. But like you said, very different sort of issue with different solutions, not any less important, but different. And then, of course, you have the Gun Violence Archive count, which is probably the most famous one, I guess, or the one that's most often repeated by media outlets, which counts 4 or more injured in any sort of shooting, regardless of motivations or circumstance. And so that one is obviously the broadest, and I think, to me at least, has the problem of incorporating a lot of very different kinds of attacks. Not that it's isn't valuable on its own to count these things to get some sort of guideline about how often multiple people are being shot in an attack. But and of course, we interviewed Mark Bryant from the Gun Violence Archive a few I believe, months back and talked about these issues. So people should check out that podcast if they want to
and
hear
that's important because
explanation.
None of these numbers is wrong. I think that's the most important thing. None of them is wrong. It's just that they are counting slightly different phenomena. And there is a risk that when people don't understand the definitions that you're using, you conflate the numbers together, and that leads to confusion in the public and in the conversations around policy and practice and everything else. So that's really the challenge here. But it's not that any of the numbers are wrong. And it's valuable that we're counting all of them, because at the end of the day, anyone who's losing their life to gun violence, and by the way, the ripple effects of those shootings as well, that deserves our attention. It deserves our action.
Yeah, certainly. And the other reason that I find your work to be particularly valuable is because your database also goes back much further than the other ones. So the Gun Violence Archive goes back to 2013, and the USA Today Associated Press database goes back to 2006. And one of the issues with that, in my eyes, is that you're missing a period of time when violent crime was much higher, which is the 70s, 80s, and 90s featured violent crime rates in the United States that were far higher than during the last 20 to 25 years in this country. And so one of the issues to me is that, you look at the Gun Violence Archive number, and it's increasing significantly over the last several years since the pandemic began. And I think what that's telling you more than that there are more mass shootings of the sort of Columbine, Uvalde, Las Vegas style. And it's more telling you that there's just an increase in gun violence generally, because they're at the highest rate they've ever recorded. But that's, I think, a large part because they only go back to 2013. And if I imagine if they were recording these numbers in 1993, 1996, they would probably be much higher than even they are right now. But that's something we can't know because the database doesn't go back that far.
Yeah, there's a possibility that's the case. You're right. Violent crime fell to historic lows. It peaked in the mid 90s, and then it fell to historic lows around 2014, 2015, and then it's been edging up ever since. And so what we see in our data is we're just tracking those mass public shootings, smaller numbers. Right. And we see still an increase in those types of events, particularly in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. Yes. But there were still some years, like 1999, the year of Columbine, for instance, was a year that did have 7 mass shootings in our database. And it is one of the highest numbers that we've recorded. But the record numbers were all, 2017, 2018, 2019. 2020 was the exception because of the pandemic. Public spaces were locked down. Mass shootings in public spaces declined. But then in 2021 and 2022, they increased again. And with 4 this year in our data so far, we're on track to be sort of matching those types of trends this year as well. So we're seeing that increase over time. But you're absolutely right. It's hard to compare when you don't have the data going back. And it's difficult to do this without the internet, is the truth. Yeah. Many of these projects, like the Gun Violence Archive, are a product of the mass information that we now have. It's much easier to track these things in real time when you can get Google News alerts and when you can actually, click on a local news station and get the information, as opposed to having to go to the library and dig around in the archives. And so this data collection is born through the modern age in many ways. And that's one of the really cool things about it, that we actually have that information available at our fingertips right now.